just for a second. Now, when I think of Gandhi, I think of this someone who's happy to tell us that he is human, and yet still able to do these deeds which all of us can barely aspire to. So we're going to read this little bit of Gandhi after our little talk. And I'd like you to, just if you want to, glance at the words of Gandhi as I give the little talk, because in a sense that's what's grounding us, this notion that it's possible to do something, no matter how we're feeling this day or any day, that can shock us in its ability to care for others. But I have another reading to start with. This is a reading that I really love. It's from Bede Griffiths. I suddenly saw that all the time it was not I who had been seeking God, but God who had been seeking me. I had made myself the centre of my own existence and had my back turned to God. All the beauty and truth which I had discovered had come to me as a reflection of his beauty, but I had kept my eyes fixed on the reflection and was still looking at myself. But God had brought me to the point at which I was compelled to turn away from the reflection, both of myself and of the world, which could only mirror my own image. During that night, the mirror had been broken, and I had felt abandoned because I could no longer gaze upon the image of my own reason and the finite world which it knew. God had brought me to my knees and made me acknowledge my own nothingness. And out of that knowledge I had been reborn. I was no longer the centre of my life. And therefore, I could see God in everything. Is that possibly the most beautiful description of the long night of the soul that we can take for ourselves? Because all this talk about bliss that we can have in India, really, we still have to deal with suffering. And the thing about Indians is they seem to deal with suffering with a grace in which is so deeply inspiring. Because most Indians understand the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha in a way we can only hope to. That the nature of this life will contain suffering for all of us. That we have to experience it. That possibly, if we are lucky and we work and we work and we work again, we can see some of that suffering when it is coming and ready ourselves for it. And only then can we take refuge in something greater. So this is what Bede tells us. Now, many of you might know the story of Bede Griffiths. Well, we don't have time to really talk about it, but it's from a mainstream experience of religion or Christianity to a mystical view of a sacred life. Life as part of a river of divinity. It's so easy to say, but it's so hard to do. It's not a transformation that we can make in a weekend, a week, or a year. It requires a cessation of something else. And maybe that is the part of us that craves normality. As such, that task, what Bede described to us so beautifully, should not be undertaken lightly. We could even say that it's hard to imagine that transformation happening anywhere but India these days. Because for most of us, life is different. We are the householders, all of us, beloved by the Buddha. We are the same householders who inspired the central tenet of Mahayana Buddhism, that everyone in this world, not just the monks, not just the priests, not just those who give the money, that anyone can achieve the highest spiritual state. In Hinduism, all castes can live as householders. And those central figures in the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, even the historical Krishna, all married and all had families. And we could say they probably all went to work too. It's an amazing thought. So India can say to us, not just the stories of miraculous change that go and dumping everything and turning up at an ashram, but India says to us that daily life can be enough if we cherish it. We might only want to experience the miraculous, but we have another role, an important role, the role of making the world function as it needs to. We are the teachers, the doctors, the parents, the aid workers, the economists, although I'm not sure if any economists are actually here today, the parents. We must also work. India, better than other countries, understands the relationships between those who renounce the world for God and those who stay within it. It says to us simply, everything in its rightful time, no matter what your religion. But before we go on, I have just a little question for us. Are we prepared in our intellectual and moral lives for an experience of the miraculous? If not, how might we prepare? If we were to experience something just a little bit like what we read of bead crickets, how would we reconcile this with our desires for a family, a home, a job and friends? We would probably like to still go to concerts, read a trashy book, see a trashy movie, but maybe not 50 Shades of Grey. So how might I define India? Well, on reflection, there were three things about India as a country that really inspire me. And I say this having had the most wonderful and difficult 8 months there. Because it's easy to say India's great, but you know, every time you're stuck and something doesn't work and someone does the wrong thing by you, it's easy to say, I've got to get out of this country. But that's precisely when we need to stay there, because something amazing always comes. I find India for me is like the teacher of life, but in fast forward. It's like at 11 times normal speed. So here's reason number one. I wanted to theme today's service around India. India is the only country that has experimented with religious tolerance throughout its history for 3,000 years and counting. One story goes that Alexander the Great was so impressed by the spiritual powers of Indian mystics that he took on yogic practices for the rest of his life and even took a yogic teacher with him after he left India. We have Ashoka, we have the Buddha, we have the breathtaking Ellora caves constructed over 3 centuries by craftsmen from 3 religions, Hindu, Jain and Buddhist. We have Kabir, who understood the similarities in all religions. We have the Sikh masters who established a spiritual meeting between Hindu and Islam, not just to achieve a oneness of God, but to solve this great problem and end this violence. We have yogic traditions which show, and still show, that individual aspiration is more important than creed. From the inspiring address of Vivekananda to the Parliament of the world's religions that we owe this very congregation to, we can give our thanks. India has also dealt with Christianity with extreme grace, although there have been in the last 10 or so years a few terrible examples of the opposite. But for about 1700 years, India has dealt with this religion very well. As the Christians poured the missionaries in on the back of economic exploitation, Indian scholars pored over the Bible to make the case for religious understanding. I'd like to give you one tiny example. I was reading the paper, I think it was mid-December last year, and it's, you know, there's so many very, very sad things we see in the papers about terrorism at the moment. And this was just a little one. It was just this big on about page 16. In December, 2 youths were found with an Islamic State flag, and they were arrested. Of course they were arrested. Who knows what they would do? But what did the authorities do? They calmly assessed the situation over a few days, and after some deliberation found that the young men were more dumb than dangerous, and they were placed in a community engagement program. Now, this is from the country that experienced the heinous crimes in Bombay so recently, a country that really knows the dangers of terrorism. Now, we know that dialogue does not always work, but the fact that it can be tried in the real front line is quite remarkable. I have seen so many examples of dialogue between Hindus and Muslims in India, that I find it hard to believe that this dialogue cannot happen in other countries. This is not to say there is no suffering. India deals with terrorism on an almost daily basis, and the relationship with Pakistan on both sides is so deeply troubling to all of us. But somehow, on the individual level, something happens that is miraculous. Now, reason number 2, India can inspire us. I've already alluded to it. India is the country that has allowed refugees of all kinds to enter throughout her history. We have the Zoroastrians, the oldest monotheistic religion in the world, who left Persia for India and thrived. We have a remnant of the Second Temple Jews who fled for their very lives, literally in the year the temple was destroyed, 70 AD. They arrived the next year in India, and the remnants are called the Black Jews of India. They have survived. Isn't that astounding? We have the early Christians fleeing the Roman tyranny. We have the many mystical variants of Islam all coming to India through the medieval period to escape persecution. We have perhaps the most moving story of our lifetimes, the offer of India, one of the poorest countries in the world at that time, to take the Tibetan people. It is not the West that has seen Tibetan Buddhism thrive. Let's be clear. It is their home in exile in India, despite the greatest pressure from the Chinese government. But it goes on right now. Pakistanis who are fleeing Wahhabism gone mad, shell-shocked Israelis fresh from serving in the occupied territories who go AWOL, and a permanent trickle of Western lost souls. These are found every day this year in India. Number 3 is probably the greatest reason why I admire India. India is the only country that still defines the spiritual quest as a normal part of life. India glorifies its saints as we do our sportsmen, and France does its philosophers. Let's think about it. The greatest event in India is not the World Cup of cricket, it's the Kumbh Mela. You talk to Indians about it, no matter what their religion, they are so proud that they have the largest religious gathering in the world, and they've had it for hundreds of years. So we have this feeling that it happens, but it happens because of something in the theology of Hinduism that has permeated to all the religions of India. It's simply known as the 4 stages of life. Stage number 1 is the stage of being a student. Classical Hinduism defines this until the age of 12. Interestingly, the same time a Jewish boy or girl takes their bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah. So these things, they're really almost like echoes within each other. In this time we are given our physical and moral and spiritual foundations from our teachers, or of course, as India would say, our Gurujis. Now at the moment I'm observing my son Babu, who of course many of you know, with his teacher in Pondicherry, and I can tell you, this sacred tryst is alive today. He sits with his teacher, and it's not always easy, but his teacher has taken him on for life. Now, if only we could do that in Australia. If only our teachers could stay with their students for 10 years, or 20 years, or even 30 years. Can we simply imagine what our society would be? Our next stage is to be a householder. And it's okay. It's okay in Hinduism and it's okay in India to give ourselves up to this. It is Hinduism before other religions, as I've already said, that allowed priests to marry, to experience this notion of normal life, even when you are teaching spirituality. It is okay to experience pleasure through marriage, power through career, and duty through our involvement in society. Our 3rd stage is retirement. Traditionally, this is when we become grandparents, but for many of us, we have our kids late now, so we retire a little bit early, and we get this incredible thing where we are both really householders and retirees at the same time. But our social and societal responsibilities are lessened. There is the opportunity to rest and recover and take stock of why we are actually here. Freed from the incessant worry over money, we can only hope that this is the destiny of everyone. We can do good in this world, such as one Indian fellow I met in his late 70s, who had decided to put his superannuation into animal shelters and was travelling parts of India, literally giving cheques out to people to manage shelters for cows and dogs and things like that. And it's not that he saw himself as remarkable. He just simply saw he was retired, he'd married off the last of his daughters, and he had to give something back. Again, let us just imagine if this were hardwired into our society, if this notion of giving from the age of 55 or 60 was almost complicit in the fabric of our society. And now we get to the final stage, which is the stage we can't even really conceive in the West because it's been gone for so long. It's the stage of the sannyasi or the renunciate. Classical Hinduism says there is a point where you have done everything you need to in this world, and you should prepare yourself for the end of this life. Now in the West we really fear death. Let's be really clear about that. We fear it for a very good reason, because it's the hardest thing that all of us will go through. But does that mean we should not prepare ourselves for it? It's the HSC times 1,000 of a spiritual nature, and yet we just stumble into it. This final stage says something remarkable. Take the time and study. Study yourself in preparation for the end of this life. But also something else happens when we have this stage. We recognize that one tiny percentage of the population, maybe 2%, maybe 0.2% of the population are like Ramana Maharshi, who we heard from before. And they simply are ready to renounce this world at the age of 10 or 20 or 30. And somehow society should provide for them if they are genuinely renouncing on the quest for unity with God. And that's what this last stage does. It allows us, the regular people of the world, to feed those who do these things. Now I can give you one little story off the top of my head. It's almost like a folk story, but in the early 20th century, in the top of the Punjab, there was a great flood coming. And many people would have died, but one sannyasi, who everyone knew as a guy just living in a cave, saw the aspect of the flood and took everyone out, saved the lives of several villagers, took them to high ground, and then took them back. And the village elders said to this man, "How come you know?" He said, "Because I was the chief of staff for the British, because I dealt with floods on a daily level. I was the third most powerful man in India, but now I'm a sannyasi." Now no one knows if this story is even true, but what an amazing thing to think about. To renounce is to renounce our name and our fame, whatever we have achieved, to say that I am simply how I started at the end. I find that so inspiring and such a model of what we can maybe do just a little of at some point in our lives. Now I've already mentioned Ramana Maharshi. The reason why I chose him is he seems to be someone who's inspired quite a lot of people in the West in the last 10 or 20 years. He had a very strong ascetic life, which started when he saw his grandmother in ill health and then die. And he had one of those reactions many of us have, which is that life is unfair. It's almost like the same thing that started the Buddha off on his quest. Suffering is so unfair, how on earth can I deal with it? And he was only able to deal with it by doing nothing until he could understand himself. And he came to this miraculous phrase, which I wanted to share with you. Who am I? The power of self-reflection, the power of the intellect harnessed to understand who we are, why we suffer, why we will always suffer in this life, why despite the best of our intentions, that every day in some small way we will probably do the wrong thing by someone. And many days in some big way we will do it. We are part of that cycle that Pippa described, of joy and suffering, of good and evil, this binary opposition of the world that we can best call duality. So we have this idea. If I ask, who am I? Ramana says that we can allow ourselves to follow, in a sense, the spiritual paper trail. And this inevitably leads to an answer that I am more than this body, this mind, these ambitions. The next result of this contemplation is that this world is impermanent. And it is followed by the thought that it may be possible for us to achieve something incredible. Maybe. It's not a guarantee. But Ramana teaches us something that is embedded in India. On some level, even we, no matter how damaged, no matter how sore physically or mentally, this day or any day, can potentially find a link with everyone. And if we do, we will never be the same again. Because people say, what is enlightenment? But a real study of India shows that enlightenment is simply being able to see ourselves in all of us. This is the simplest definition of that state. It's not an airy-fairy thing. It's not levitating. It's being able to see with compassion every single being. Now, I'd like to share with you briefly, before we go on to our service, the other place I was living, which was just near the Sri Aurobindo ashram for 8 months in Oroville. And I must say, I came to Aurobindo maybe 4 or 5 years ago with some trouble, because Aurobindo is a magnificent writer, a thinker, someone who really took on the British, went to jail, looking for Indian self-determination, and he was a very reluctant spiritualist, I guess you would say. He took it on because he was so dissatisfied with politics, which is something we can probably understand right now. And so then he experimented for many years, people say up to 45 years, on the best ways, if he was to use his remarkable intellect to evolve as a species. And he came up with something which I think is worth thinking about. Unlike most teachers in India, who say that maybe if I'm lucky I might achieve enlightenment, but who's met an enlightened person? You know, it seems to be like the holy myth of India. But we have something different from Aurobindo. We have the promise that what we do when we work on ourselves is, in some small way, we are allowing our species to evolve. That actually our task is a task of evolution. It is not the task of selfish spiritual pursuit. It is actually to say that whatever we do with our community, and we take it with us, and we share it immediately. And by sharing those insights, we are able to grow something just as we water the garden around us. And that, to me, is such a profound teaching, isn't it? Nothing just for me alone. Everything to be shared. So I'd like to finish our little sojourn with a return to our service. And one more quote. That quote we had from Meher Baba, another very interesting Indian saint, a saint who gave up speech for the last third of his life because he was sure he could communicate more to us as people without talking. Now, isn't that a remarkable thing to think about? Here's his quote again. Everyone, no matter how depraved, can gradually become better and better until they become the best example for all humankind. There is always hope for everyone. None is utterly lost and none need despair. It remains true, however, that the way to divinity lies through the renunciation of evil in favour of good. Friends, this surely is possible to some extent for all of us. And for what it is worth, I ask us in this new year to take the time to attempt it. Om Shanti.